So, Dr. Mitchell, would you want to? I don't think you need to introduce me, but yeah, if you'd like to um, maybe say a word or two and then open us with a word of prayer.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. Number one, just thanks to Jared for doing this, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know this is a different environment for us to have a symposium in, but Jared really wanted to do this, and it made a lot of sense that we should at least try it once this semester. And so I'm just really grateful to him for being willing to do it. So if you would just allow me to pray for us all, and then I'll turn it back over to Dr. Brandt. So Lord, we bless you for your grace and your mercy. We thank you for your great love to us. I pray that in this time that as challenging as it can be for some of us, that the life of the mind would not grow slack, but that we might grow in knowing you and knowing you better and carrying on that great conversation with our culture and the ideas around us. Pray you would bless Jared today and help us to think well along with him. And so I just pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So before I get started with the paper, I wanted to say a few words about it, just to tell you all, how it got to this point. So let me share this with you. I might be a little distracted as people add, just because I have to admit them through the waiting room. Brent, thanks for listening in. He says he's going to keep his video off because his kids are going nuts. So he's listening in. So to start things off, I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with philosophy. My undergrad experience was almost exclusively dealing with contemporary philosophy. And so my first real exposure to the history of philosophy was when I went to Baylor and started graduate school there. And my very first semester, I took a seminar on Plato. And I know it sounds really strange to be in a philosophy PhD program and reading Plato for the very first time, but there I was. And so this paper started with the paper I wrote for that class. I was fascinated with Socrates. I was fascinated with the Daimonion, this divine sign that he talks about. Those of you that are in my intro class, this is just a few weeks ago for you, so you'll remember it well. But yeah, I found this topic really interesting. And so I wrote the paper for the class. I submitted it to a conference, an ancient philosophy conference. So it got accepted there. That was my first conference that I went to. So this paper was the very first one I presented at a philosophy conference. I can still remember how nervous I was then. And so then after that, I reworked it a little bit and submitted it to another conference. And this version that you're going to hear today is the version that I submitted to that conference. And it was a conference that published their proceedings. And so it's published in the Southwestern Journal of Philosophy, this version is. And so I got some good feedback on it. And my professor, Dr. Anne Marie Schultz at Baylor, recommended that I continue working on it and try and get it published in one of the kind of respectable ancient philosophy journals. And so I had to do some things to the paper to make it more attractive and interesting to a top ancient philosophy journal. And those things that I did, I think, would make it far less interesting to all of you. So that's why I'm reading you the older version, which I actually like better. This one's shorter. That one's pretty lengthy. And it's just too technical. So that's why I'm reading you this one. But that one did get accepted for publication. So the journal is Paragon. That version's published there. So you could probably go find that if you wanted to. But I'm going to start, I'm going to read this one to you because I like it better, and I think you will too. And I'll confess that I haven't read it in probably 3 years, so we'll see how this goes. I might find something that I disagree with now, So if that comes up, I'll mention it. But we'll go ahead and start. And so I'll read these two opening quotes first, and then I'll go back and share the handout with you. I'm saving space on the handout by putting these here. So the title, Socrates and his Daimonion, a Paragon of Rationality, ? So the first quote is from Gregory Vlastos, very influential Plato scholar. He says, if I believed that whatever rational reasons Socrates might have for doing or not doing X, a sign from the Daimonion could trump them, my respect for Socrates would plummet. I would then have to think of him as a superstitious man who puts higher trust in the subjective suggestions he gets from signs received through the Daimonion than in reflective, rational judgments. And as I realize this, I'm thinking some of you might not know what the Daimonion is. So if you've read some of Plato, Socrates talks about this divine sign, or sometimes he calls it a voice, that speaks to him whenever he's about to do something. And his interpretation of this event is that it stops him from doing something he's about to do. And as he reflects back on it later, he thinks, everything I was about to do was wrong. And so this divine sign kind of interferes and stops him from doing something wrong. So that's what's going on there. Vlastos says if Socrates had decided on something and then did something else because of this, he would lose his respect for him. But look at what Socrates says. This is in the Phaedrus. My friend, just as I was about to cross the river, the familiar divine sign came to me, which, whenever it occurs, holds me back from something I'm about to do. I thought I heard a voice coming from this very spot, forbidding me to leave until I made atonement for some offense against the gods. In effect, you see, I am a seer. Okay, so now I realized I didn't need to say all of that to explain it, because that quote kind of did. But here we go. Here's the handout, so you guys can look at that as I read the paper. Scholars have often held Socrates to be a paragon of rationality, for whom reason was the ultimate arbiter in deliberation. For these thinkers, Socrates' life perfectly matched his claim in the Crito. I am not just now, but in fact I've always been the sort of person who's persuaded by nothing but the reason that appears to me to be best when I've considered it. However, the many references to the Daimonion as an overriding influence on Socrates' actions cast doubt on his adherence to this claim. In these instances, Socrates obeys the extra-rational Daimonion immediately and unreflectively. Brickhouse and Smith, in their 2005 book, put the dilemma like this, and this is on your handout. Either we find some way to understand the Daimonion that entirely removes the apparent strain of irrationality from Socrates' reliance on it, or we simply refuse to accept Socrates' claim always to rely only upon rational sources of persuasion. This was a very serious issue for the great Socrates scholar Gregory Vlastos, as evidenced by the opening quotation. Should we agree with Vlastos, or can we continue to respect Socrates? Sorry, I'm moving things around. Continue to respect Socrates even if at times he is motivated by something other than the best reason. I will begin to answer this question by looking at Socrates' responses to different types of divinatory experiences, that is, oracles, dreams, and the Daimonion. Viewed in this larger context, his treatment of the Daimonion is unique in that Socrates, somebody just rang in. No, okay. It's unique in that Socrates always complies immediately and unreflectively with the Daimonion. Next, I look at some recent attempts to rationalize Socrates' Daimonion, including those of Brickhouse and Smith, Reeve, and McPherron. I argue that these attempts are unsuccessful. Then I suggest an alternative way of understanding Socrates' trust in the Daimonion, which draws on the work of Merold Westphal. On this view, Socrates' trust stems from a recognition of the god's status as the only true absolute. I argue that this interpretation is consistent with all the evidence we have concerning Socrates and the phenomenon of the Daimonion. In light of this, I conclude that Socrates does not live up to the title of Paragon of Rationality, as it is commonly understood, but that the common understanding does not represent the ideal. Socrates and divinatory experience. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates experiences three main types of divination. First, there are numerous references to his encounter with the oracle at Delphi. Second, Socrates often describes dreams as having divinatory content. Third, he treats the monitions of his daimonion as divinatory. And monitions is a weird word. I don't know why in the literature that's come to be associated with the signs of this divine sign. Vlastos was very concerned to show that all of Socrates' divinatory experiences were subject to rational interpretation. Vlastos points out that the Phaedo and the Apology show Socrates expressing uncertainty about his interpretation of the divinatory experience. For example, in the Phaedo, Socrates says that he had imagined that it was instructing and advising him to practice philosophy, but that in case his dream was bidding him to compose poetry, he wrote some poems. Also, in the Apology passage, Socrates says, "The god ordered me, as I thought and believed, to live the life of a philosopher, to examine myself and others." For Vlastos, these passages prove that Socrates' divinatory experiences were subject to rational interpretation. However, it's important to notice that both of these passages involve only the first two types of divinatory experience. Neither passage makes reference to the daimonion. Furthermore, when we examine Socrates' encounters with the daimonion, we find that he always complies immediately and unreflectively. For example, in the Euthydemus, Socrates says that he was about to leave the undressing room, but when I got up, my customary divine sign put in an appearance, so I sat down again. Similarly, in the Apology, he says, "It often held me back in the middle of my speaking." The primary function of the daimonion seems to be that of stopping Socrates when he's about to do something bad or harmful. Smith elaborates, he doesn't yet know why he should stop, but that he should stop is something Socrates never treats with even a hint of agnosticism. From these examples, we can conclude that the daimonion is unique among these types of divinatory experiences in two ways. First, McFerrin points out that the function of the daimonion is distinct from that of dreams and oracles. It always acts to prevent him from performing a certain action that he has decided to perform, instead of positively recommending some course of action. Secondly, Socrates' response to the daimonion is unique. He views its monitions as providing immediate and overriding reasons for action, as opposed to oracles and dreams, which are in need of interpretation. In light of this, we should conclude that Socrates' trust in the monitions of his daimonion surpasses the trust that he can or would place in the products of logical reasoning. Importantly, it is consistent to endorse this conclusion while maintaining Socrates' status as a paragon of rationality. For example, Brickhouse and Smith, McFerrin, and Reeve have attempted to show that Socrates' trust in the daimonion is rational. I will now turn to this discussion. So this is the section on your handout marked Rationalizing the Daimonion. There have been numerous attempts to rationalize Socrates' trust in the daimonion. However, among scholars that recognize the superior nature of that trust, two approaches have become prominent: the foundationalist approach of Reeve and McFerrin, and the empiricist approach of Brickhouse and Smith. I will explore each in turn. According to the foundationalist approach, you guys with me? It says my internet connection is unstable. You still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. According to the foundationalist approach, Socrates' trust in the daimonion is based upon his belief in the essential goodness of the gods. However, Socrates came to hold this belief through the rational process of Elenchus. As Reeve states, Socrates is willing then to obey divine commands and prohibitions simply on the basis of the elenctically established goodness of the gods. Elenchus there, that's just argumentation. Therefore, Socrates' trust in the daimonion is still rational because it is based on a rationally derived belief. For that derivation, proponents of this view often point to the passage in Book 2 of the Republic, in which Socrates argues that the gods can only be the cause of good things. McFerrin takes it a step further by claiming that since our human minds cannot reliably predict the future, it is eminently rational for Socrates to place his trust in the predictive capacities of his rationally warranted daimonic alternative. The foundationalist approach might seem very appealing, but there are reasons to avoid it. First, Brickhouse and Smith point out that Socrates has experienced the daimonion since childhood. Therefore, they conclude that Socrates either did not trust the monitions that came before his settled belief in the god's goodness, or did trust those inappropriately. Either way, the early monitions of the daimonion were somehow not on par with those that occurred later in Socrates' life. As Brickhouse and Smith put it, nothing in the text, however, suggests any significant change in the epistemic value of the daimonion in Socrates' life. Secondly, the foundationalist approach is problematic because it does not fully preserve Socrates' claim to rationality. Unconditional trust in the daimonion would only be rational if Socrates was certain that his belief in the essential goodness of the gods was true. However, it is widely accepted that the rational process of Elenchus, in Socrates' view, did not provide certainty. Therefore, Socrates' unconditional trust in the daimonion would not have been rational on the foundationalist account. For these two reasons, it looks as if Socrates' trust in the daimonion was not based upon his rationally derived belief in the essential goodness of the gods. On the empiricist approach, Socrates' trust in the daimonion is based upon its past reliability. Brickhouse and Smith put it like this: for Socrates, a long life in which experiences of his daimonion have been frequent, together with his own observations of the results of accepting the daimonion's warnings, have provided substantial, suitable corroboration for Socrates' trust in his daimonion. This view can be combined with a reliabilist understanding of warrant or justification. According to Brickhouse and Smith, reliabilists claim that what provides warrant for a true belief, and so what qualifies that belief as knowledge, is its having been generated or is sustained by cognitive processes that reliably cause or sustain true beliefs. Therefore, the reliability of the daimonion allows us to maintain that Socrates' trust in it is rational. However, the empiricist approach is not without its problems. Like the foundationalist approach, it seems to have trouble accounting for Socrates' early experiences with the daimonion. If Socrates' trust is based on the daimonion's reliability, then there must have been cases in which Socrates either 1, did not trust it and found that he should have, or 2, trusted it irrationally. However, Brickhouse and Smith themselves point out that nothing in the text, I quoted this earlier, suggests any significant change in the epistemic value of the daimonion in Socrates' life. Furthermore, McFerrin notes that there is no instance in our text of Socrates ignoring the daimonion, and thus no case of Socrates actively attempting to ground the daimonion through a process of disconfirmation. The second problem with the empiricist approach is that the degree of trust that Socrates puts in the daimonion is not warranted, even on the reliabilist account of warrant. Socrates treats the daimonion as providing an unconditional and immediate reason for action. However, his empirical evidence justifies him in believing that it is likely that something bad will happen if he does not heed the daimonion's warning. This belief does not justify treating the daimonion as an unconditional reason for action. Consider Socrates' choice not to take part in politics. We discussed this at length in the intro class. It's not clearly rational to avoid an opportunity to bring about a great amount of good on the grounds that it is likely that something bad will happen. Furthermore, Socrates oversteps the bounds of the rational in the Apology when he infers that death is good from the mere absence of a sign of the daimonion. In light of these problems, the reliability of the daimonion is not enough to make Socrates' trust in it thoroughly rational. Therefore, I've demonstrated that both the foundationalist and the empiricist approaches to rationalizing the daimonion are inadequate. In the next section, I will develop an alternative way of understanding Socrates' trust in the daimonion, which does not involve rationalization. So this section is titled Socrates and the Absolute. Recall Brickhouse and Smith's dilemma quoted in the introduction. Either we find some way to understand the Daimonion that entirely removes the apparent strain of irrationality from Socrates' reliance on it, or we simply refuse to accept Socrates' claim always to rely only upon rational sources of persuasion. After raising this dilemma, they say, naturally, sympathetic scholars have found little to attract them in the second of these two options. Why is it so natural that these sympathetic scholars are not attracted to the second option? I submit that this is due to preconceptions about the priority of rationality that these scholars are bringing to the text. Vlastos's claim in the opening quotation is a great example. His views on rationality provide him with personal motivation for preserving a robust understanding of Socratic rationality. While the religious dimension of Socrates' philosophy has been embarrassing enough to many philosophers, an extra rationally motivated Socrates would be unbearable. Therefore, the Crito passage, Socrates claimed to be persuaded only by the best reason, has become the fixed point relative to which all of Socrates' actions are interpreted. However, I argue that a strong emphasis on this one passage has led to a distorted understanding of Socrates' views. These preconceptions concerning the priority of rationality are not universal among philosophers. For example, Merrill Westphal advocates a position known as perspectivism. And the quote here is on your handout. The basic point is quite simply that we are not God. We do not occupy an absolute, all-encompassing point of view, but see whatever we see, including right and wrong, from a particular standpoint constituted to a significant degree by contingencies of linguistic usage and socio-historical location. Westphal challenges philosophers to recognize that what seems to us to be in accord with reason depends upon our perspectives. Socrates seems to have anticipated this insight. Even in the Crito passage, Socrates acknowledges his limitations. He does not say that he is persuaded by the best reason, but the reason that appears to him to be the best. To use Westphal's terms, Socrates recognizes that his rationality is not absolute. There is also evidence that Socrates endorsed the stronger claim that human rationality in general is not absolute. For example, in the Apology, Socrates claims that the oracle's comments about his wisdom generalize to all people. He says of the God that when he says this man, Socrates, he is using my name as an example, as if he said, this man among you mortals is wisest, who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. This shows that Socrates recognizes the limits of human rationality and is open to extra-rational or divinatory reasons for action. Objectively, Socrates cannot provide convincing arguments for the reliability of the Daimonion. He recognizes the phenomenon as external in origin, yet subjectively compelling. Even though he sees the Daimonion's silence as convincing proof for the goodness of death, he recognizes that it would not convince his fellow Athenians. So he offers supplemental arguments. Socrates lacks objective certainty as to its reliability or origin, yet is willing to live his entire life in ready obedience to his divine sign. Consider his comments in the Phaedo, which follow his myth about the afterlife. And this is on your handout, the last quote on the page. No sensible man would insist that these things are as I have described them, but I think it is fitting for a man to risk the belief, for the risk is a noble one, that this, or something like it, is true about our souls and their dwelling places, since the soul is evidently immortal, and a man should repeat this to himself as if it were an incantation, which is why I have been prolonging my tale. Socrates recognizes that no sensible person would insist on the accuracy of his myth, which is all about what happens after death. He recognizes that it is risky to allow this belief to shape one's life. He recognizes the possibility that death could be terrible. However, he thinks this belief is fitting for man. It is a noble risk or a great hope. These attitudes are explicitly tied to Socrates' trust in the Daimonion, which, as I have shown, is unconditional despite a lack of objective certainty. So in conclusion, I've affirmed the view of several Socrates scholars that Socrates' trust in the monitions of the Daimonion surpasses the trust that he can or would place in the products of logical reasoning. There have been many attempts to show that this trust is entirely rational. In section 3, I looked at 2 of the best attempts and found that they fail. In section 4, I proposed a more attractive option, which views Socrates' trust in the Daimonion as a recognition of the God's status as the only true absolute. This option does not involve current preconceptions about rationality and still fits with the evidence we have concerning Socrates and his trust in the Daimonion. Therefore, as the title of Paragon of Rationality is commonly understood, Socrates does not qualify. Despite this conclusion, I believe that we should continue to respect Socrates. The fact that he does not live up to the title of Paragon of Rationality, as commonly understood, is not problematic, because the common understanding does not represent the ideal. Socrates was someone who recognized that neither he nor his rationality was absolute. Instead, he recognized the only true absolute, the God, and lived his life accordingly. Socrates' trust in the Daimonion, which has been seen as a blemish, might actually be an essential part of what makes him an ideal rational agent. As he says in the Apology, "Men of Athens, I am grateful, and I am your friend, but I will obey the God rather than you, and as long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not cease to practice philosophy." Thank you.